This week, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio was roundly criticized last week and even accused of being anti-Semitic when he directed a tweet about social distancing violations at, quote, the Jewish community, end quote. But as always, nothing is as clear-cut as it seems on Twitter, so let's talk about it. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. Before I go into what Mayor Bill de Blasio said, I just want to back up and give you a first-person perspective on what I think a lot of people on Twitter saw on the night of April 28th, because here's what I saw. That Tuesday evening, some photos popped up on my Twitter feed of a street in North Brooklyn that was absolutely packed with ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jews. There was a funeral procession of a rabbi who had just died of COVID-19, and the police were apparently there trying to shut it down and send the crowd home. Now, keep in mind, New York City has had one of the worst COVID-19 outbreaks in the United States, with around 14,000 confirmed deaths and, when accounting for people who died without being diagnosed, a total of almost 20,000 deaths. On top of that, ultra-Orthodox Jews have gotten a lot of bad press because of a visible minority that has disregarded New York's stay-at-home order and social distancing guidelines. So my first reaction to seeing these photos of a crowded funeral was, oh my god, what are these people doing? Not again. And my reaction, that of a mostly secular non-Orthodox Jew, is exactly why I'm bringing up this situation on this episode, because it speaks to the divide between the ultra-Orthodox Jewish world and the non-ultra-Orthodox Jewish world. But that's something I'll come back to in a moment. Because the story of that Tuesday evening kept rolling. Not only did the police have to shut down this funeral, but New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio showed up personally to disperse the crowd. And then he got on Twitter and tweeted 3 wonderful times. Now, for those of you who aren't on Twitter, basically you have 280 characters to post or tweet whatever you want. For longer thoughts, you can thread, meaning connect multiple tweets, so that they are all seen at once in a connected format, sort of in context of each other. So, de Blasio tweeted once about the funeral without saying explicitly this was related to the Jews, which was fine. Then he tweeted this, quote, "My message to the Jewish community and all communities is simple. The time for warnings has passed. I have instructed the NYPD to proceed immediately to summons or even arrest those who gather in large groups. This is about stopping this disease and saving lives. Period." End quote. Which was not so fine. A funeral had happened in North Brooklyn, and the entire Jewish community got singled out by the mayor of New York City. It has to be mentioned that before the coronavirus lockdown, there had been an increase in violent attacks on ultra-Orthodox Jews, and in the current pandemic, anti-Semites are busy blaming COVID-19 on the Jews. So even more so, to put the blame on social distancing violations on, quote, the Jewish community, and to point to all of us, was a disgrace. And then de Blasio posted a general tweet about understanding the need to mourn, but restating that large gatherings just led to more deaths. Which was a perfectly fine tweet, but at this point, the one about the Jewish community had so much blowback that no one was paying attention to anything else de Blasio was trying to say. The next day, the story of the funeral became clearer. A well-known Hasidic rabbi had died, and thinking that a funeral procession could still be done with social distancing and with police help, his synagogue and community got in touch with the local police to block off a few roads and make this all happen. But the funeral procession got packed. Because the rabbi was an important figure, and ultra-Orthodox Jewish funerals, particularly for communal leaders, are never small affairs. People show up. So when community members were told, well, they can show up, and the police were there and masks were being handed out, that was a pretty legitimate go-ahead. But then once it became clear that this was a crowd brought together during a pandemic in a community that has already been hit hard by COVID-19, the police reversed and tried to shut it down. So, in a way, everything went wrong, and then de Blasio couldn't calm down enough to think about what he was tweeting. Now, what I actually find more interesting is what happened after all this, because a lot of Jews were pretty angry, and while many said that de Blasio's tweet had been idiotic, some accused him of being anti-Semitic in deliberately singling out the Jews in New York City. After all, that same day, New Yorkers had been packing the parks and not social distancing with lots of photos and videos to prove it. Why one standard for Jews and another for everyone else? Would it have been okay for de Blasio to tweet out and address a message to the Muslim community singling them out for violations and arrests? But there were groups of Jews that largely avoided calling the mayor anti-Semitic, and that was the ultra-Orthodox groups. In fact, the synagogue that had organized the funeral apologized for their failed experiment and defended de Blasio, saying in a statement that, quote, "We know that the mayor's reaction came from his concern for the health and safety of our community," end quote. The Hasidic community the synagogue belongs to, which had split into two factions several years ago, also released statements, one from each faction, of course, telling the community to follow social distancing guidelines and the stay-at-home order. One of the statements also explicitly said, quote, "We want to disavow the attacks and derogatory language against our mayor," end quote. And strangely enough, there was also a public letter of protest addressed to de Blasio that was signed by Jewish organizations and people across the Jewish denominational and political spectrum, except for ultra-Orthodox organizations and Jews, which is a weird absence considering the situation. But also, not that weird. A few months ago, I did an episode of this podcast about the No Hate, No Fear rally against anti-Semitism that was being organized by mainstream Jewish communal organizations in New York City in January. And it was organized because ultra-Orthodox Jews were being physically attacked, and the rest of the Jewish community wanted to show up in solidarity, which was great. But very few ultra-Orthodox Jews and organizations actually showed up or co-sponsored this rally about them. So what you ended up with was a whole bunch of Jews, secular, reform, conservative, modern Orthodox, whatever else, sort of taking over the conversation about what one corner of the community was actually going through. And that seems to have been repeated in this funeral situation a little bit. Ultra-Orthodox groups and communities in New York City have a pretty close relationship with de Blasio going back years. So while his tweet singling out the Jewish community was definitely in poor taste, ultra-Orthodox leaders largely brushed it off without a second thought. But that's not necessarily how all the other Jews who saw that tweet were feeling when they pitched in to criticize de Blasio. And that raises this constant question of who speaks for the Jews. We like to talk about ourselves as a Jewish community, a one big thing, but really we're splintered and fractured, and different corners of the Jews and different smaller Jewish communities have very different relationships with the government or whatever powers there may be. So when de Blasio meant to be singling out and talking to this specific ultra-Orthodox Hasidic community, should we all fall in line behind how they then interact with de Blasio? Are the rest of us speaking out in defense of that community or for that community? I mean, truly, whose voice should we be listening to here? And does it even matter, seeing as we're all entitled as Jews to speak for ourselves in whatever capacity? Another aspect that this situation brought up is the matter of internal bias. To come back to my initial reaction on Twitter when I saw all of this go down and seeing those photos of Hasidic Jews not social distancing after all of the other photos and news and issues I've seen of secret religious gatherings and disregard for the stay-at-home order, I have to be honest about my bias. Like probably most non-ultra-Orthodox Jews, there is always a voice in the back of my head that looks at these communities and says, "Oh my God, they're so backwards." But my bias doesn't make me right. And judging by some public reactions from Jews on Twitter to de Blasio, definitely some people were angry not just that de Blasio singled out the entire Jewish community for one group's social distancing violations, but that it felt like de Blasio was saying all the Jews are just like them. And all the Jews who have that anti-ultra-Orthodox bias jumped at the chance to yell, "Hell no, I am not like those backwards Jews." And that's an attitude we have to be careful about whenever these situations come up. And again, the people who are not social distancing are a minority in that community. Depending on what block you're standing on, a minority can look very different, but still, it's not like the entire community is disregarding the stay-at-home order. Most people are staying home. There is accountability. Even as tons of non-Jewish New Yorkers are totally not social distancing. But the non-Orthodox Jewish communities, and the non-Jewish world more broadly, has this fascination with all the things the ultra-Orthodox world is doing wrong, and so we zero in on it. And every situation of ultra-Orthodox Jews not social distancing turns into an enormous fiasco. And then, once we get over thinking about all of the things the ultra-Orthodox must be doing wrong, many Jews end up sort of talking over them, like when it came to reacting to de Blasio or organizing the No Hate, No Fear rally in New York City. And I just want to be clear. Solidarity is not a bad thing. It is a good thing. And I think that de Blasio deserved the criticism for such a tone-deaf tweet. But also, the complicated interplay of the different parts of the Jewish community is something we gotta pay attention to and try to understand. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringauz. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.